Welcome as we continue to have insights on the Bible. Today we're talking about introduction to the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Pentateuch, which encompasses of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. The first section of the Jewish and the Christian scriptures is titled in English Genesis, comes from the Greek of Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, literally the book of the generation, Genesis, of the heavens and earth. His title in the Jewish scriptures is the opening of Hebrew word Bereshit, in the beginning. The book has two major sections, the creation and expansion of the human race, chapter 2 verse 4 to chapter 11 verse 9, and the story of Abraham and his descendants, chapter 11 verse 10 to chapter 50 verse 26. The first section deals with God and the nations, and the second deals with God and a particular nation, Israel. The opening creation accounts, chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 3, lifts up two themes that play a major role in each section. The divine command to the first couple standing for the world race to produce offspring and to possess land, chapter 1 verse 28. In the first section, progeny and lands appears in the form of births and genealogies, chapter 2 to 9, and allotment of land, chapters 10 to 11. And in the second progeny, the land appears in the form of promises of descendants in land to the ancestors. Another indication of editing is the formulaic introduction. This is the story. These are the descendants. Hebrew Toledot, which occurs 5 times in section 1, chapter 2 verse 4, chapter 5 verse 1, chapter 6 verse 9, chapter 10 verse 1, chapter 10 verse 31, and 5 times in section 2, chapter 11 verse 10, chapter 25 verse 12, chapter 19, chapter 36 verse 1, and verse 9 is an addition, chapter 37 verse 2. Composition of the book. For the literary sources of Genesis, Introduction to Pentateuch, as far as the sources of Genesis are concerned, contemporary readers can reasonably assume that ancient tradition J and E were edited in the 6th or 5th century BC for a Jewish audience that had suffered the effects of the exile and was now largely living outside the Palestine. The editor highlighted theme of vital concern to this audience. God intends that every nation have posterity and land. The ancestors of Israel are models of their descendants who also live in hope rather than in full possession of what has been promised. The ancient covenant with God is eternal, remaining valid even when the human party has been unfaithful. By highlighting such concerns, the editor addressed the worries of exiled Israel and indeed of contemporary Jews and Christians. The editor addressed of worries of exiled Israel and indeed of contemporary Jews and Christians. Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 11. The 7-day creation account in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 to 2 verse 3 tells of a God whose mere words creates a beautiful universe in which human beings are an integral and important part. Though Genesis 2 verse 4 to 3 verse 24 is often regarded as the second creation story, the text suggests that the whole of chapter 2 verse 4 to chapter 11 verse 9 tells one story. The plot of Genesis chapter 2 to chapter 11, creation, the flood, renewed creation, has been borrowed from creation flood stories attested in Mesopotamian literature of the second and early first millennia. In the Mesopotamian creation flood stories, the gods created the human race as slaves whose task is to manage the universe for them, giving them food, clothing, and honor in temple ceremonies. In an unforeseen development, however, the human race grew so numerous and noisy that the gods could not sleep. Deeply angered, the gods decided to destroy the race by a universal flood. One man and his family, however, secretly warned the flood by his patron god, built a boat and survived, soon regretting their impetuous decision. The gods created a revised version of humankind. The new race was created mortal, so they could never again grow numerous and bother the gods. The authors of Genesis adapted the creation flood story in accord with their views of God and humanity. For example, they attributed the fault to human sin rather than to divine miscalculation. Chapter 6, verses 5 to 7, and God reaffirmed without charge the original creation. The authors of Genesis adapted the new race. The new race was created mortal so they would never again grow numerous and bother the gods. The authors of Genesis adapted the creation flood story in accord with their views of God and humanity. For example, they attributed the fault to human sin rather than to divine miscalculation. Chapter 6, verses 5 to 7, and had God reaffirm without charge the original creation. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. In the biblical version, God is just, powerful, and not needy. How should modern readers interpret the creation flood story in Genesis chapter 2 to 11? The stories are neither history nor myth. Myth is an unsuitable term, for it has several different meanings and connotes untruth in popular English. History is equally misleading, for it suggests that the events actually took place. The best term is creation flood story. Ancient Near East thinkers did not have our methods of exploring serious questions. Instead, they used narratives for issues that we would call philosophical and theological. They added and subtracted narrative details and varied the plot as they sought meaning in ancient stories. Their stories reveal a privileged time when divine decisions were made that determined the future of the human race. The origin of something was thought to explain its present meaning. For example, how God acts with justice and generosity, why human beings are rebellious, the nature of sexual attraction and marriage, why there are many people and languages. Though the stories may initially strike us as primitive and naive, they are in fact told with skill, compression, and subtlety. They provide profound answers to perennial questions about God and human beings. Genesis chapters 11 to 50. One Jewish tradition suggests that God, having been rebuffed in the attempt to forge a relationship with the nations, decided to concentrate on one nation in the hope that it will eventually bring in all the nations. The migration of Abraham's family, chapter 11, verse 26 to 31, is part of the general movement of the human race to take possession of their lands. Chapter 10, verse 32 to chapter 11, verse 9. Abraham, however, must come into possession of his land in a manner different from the nations, for he will not immediately possess it, nor will he have descendants in the manner of the nations, for he is old and his wife is childless. Chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. Abraham and Sarah have to live with their God in trust and obedience until at last Isaac is born to them and they manage to buy a sliver of the land, the burial cave at Machpelah, chapter 23. Abraham's humanity and faith offer a wonderful example to the exilic generation. The historicity of the ancestral stories has been much discussed. Scholars have traditionally dated them sometime in the first half of the second millennium, though a few regard them as late 6th or 5th century BC and purely fictional. There is unfortunately no direct extra-biblical evidence confirming or disproving the stories. The ancestral stories have affinities, however, to late second millennium stories of childless ancestors, and their proper names fit linguistic patterns attested in the second millennium. Given the lack of decisive evidence, it's reasonable to accept the Bible's own chronology that the patriarchs were the ancestors of Israel and that they lived well before the Exodus, that is generally dated in the 13th century. Genesis chapter 25, verse 19 to 35, verse 43 are about Jacob and his 12 sons. The stories are united by a geographical frame. Jacob lived in Canaan until his theft, the right of the firstborn, from his brother Esau forces him to flee Padan Aram. There his uncle Laban tricks him as he earlier tricked his brother. But Jacob is blessed with wealth and sons. He returned to Canaan to receive the final blessing, land, and on the way is reconciled with his brother Esau. As the sons have reached the number of 12, the patriarch can be given the name Israel. Chapter 32 verse 28 and chapter 35 verse 10. The blessings given to Abraham are reaffirmed to Isaac and to Jacob. The last cycle of ancestor stories is about Jacob's son Joseph, chapter 37 verse 1 to chapter 50 verse 26. Though in chapters 48 to 49 the focus swings back to Jacob. The Joseph stories are sophisticated in theme, deftly plotted, and show keen interest in the psychology of the characters. Jacob's favoring of Joseph, the son of his beloved wife Rachel, provokes his brothers to kill him. Joseph escapes death through the intercession of Reuben the eldest and of Judah, but is sold into slavery in Egypt. In the immediately following chapter 38, Judah undergoes experiences similar to Joseph. Endowed by God with wisdom, becomes second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. From that powerful position, he encounters his unsuspecting brothers who have come to Egypt because of the famine, and tests them to see if they have repented. Joseph learns that they have given up their hatred because of their love to Israel, their father Judah, who seems to have inherited the mantle of their failed oldest brother Reuben, expresses the brothers' new and profound appreciation of their father and Joseph's. Chapter 44. At the end of Genesis, the entire family of Jacob or Israel is in Egypt, which prepares for the events in the book of Exodus. Genesis in the later biblical books. The historical and prophetic books constantly refer to the covenant with the ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hosea 10 sees the traits of Jacob in the behavior of Israel of his own day. Isaiah 51 verse 2 cites Abraham and Sarah as a model of his dispirited community. For thou only a couple, they began a great nation. John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word alludes to Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Proverbs chapter 8 verse 22 to show that Jesus is creating a new world. St. Paul interprets Jesus as the new Adam in Romans chapter 5 verse 14 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 22 and 24, whose obedience brings life just as the old Adam's disobedience brought death. In Romans chapter 4, Paul cites Abraham as second, who was righteous in God's eyes centuries before the law was given at Sinai. Thank you. Below are the outlines of Genesis. There is preamble, the creation of the world, as chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 3. The first one, the story of the nations, that's chapter 2 verse 4 to chapter 11 verse 26. Part A, the creation of the man and the woman, their offspring and the spread of civilization. Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 to chapter 4 verse 26. Chapter B, the pre-floods generation, chapter 5 verse 1 to chapter 6 verse 8. Part C, the flood and the renewed blessings, chapter 6 verse 9 to chapter 9 verse 29. Part D, the populating of the world and the prideful city, chapter 10 verse 1 to chapter 11 verse 9. Part E, the genealogy from Shem to Terah, chapter 11 verse 10 to 26. The second part of E, the story of the ancestors of Israel, chapter 11 verse 27 to chapter 50 verse 26, which has two parts. A, the story of Abraham and Sarah, which is chapter 11 verse 27 to chapter 25 verse 18. Part B, the story of Isaac and Jacob, chapter 25 verse 19 to chapter 36 verse 43. And Part C, the story of Joseph, chapter 37 verse 1 to chapter 50 verse 26. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining me, and continue having insights on the Bible. Thank you.